Welcome to iStat Part Dos, Numero Dos. We just did glucose and potassium before, and now we're going to do sodium, chloride, and calcium. It's important to know that Na is the elemental name for sodium and Cl is for chloride, mostly for sodium because if an increase is a hypernatremia. And so it's important to see the root word for sodium, the natremia. So how do you get a hyper or hyponatremia? When you see this on your iStat, what sort of diseases should you be thinking about? Well, let's talk about hyponatremia because it's much more common than hypernatremia. So hyponatremia might be meaning that you're losing sodium in your urine, one place to lose it, or your gut would be another place to lose it. So that could be, let's see, renal failure. I might waste sodium. If I'm on a diuretic, so most diuretics that are loop diuretics, like furosemide, work on the loop. So here's your glomerulus and then your tubule. And so they work on the loop of Henle to basically stop the channel that brings back sodium and potassium and chloride into your bloodstream. So this sodium gets lost into the urine. And if you lose sodium, what likes to go with sodium? Water. And that's how it makes you pee too much. So if you're on a loop diuretic, it's very easy to get a low sodium. Another way that you lose sodium is if you're diabetic. And if you're diabetic, diabetes mellitus, then you will pee out more urine because you're peeing out sugar, and that draws out more sodium. Now, how about the gut? So that might be with vomiting and diarrhea, and that's probably a lot of the cases that we see. We're losing it that way. Another hormonal way that you can get hyponatremia is with Addison's. So Addison's is, if you're a typical Addison, you not only don't have cortisol, so you might see gut signs with that because the gut is very sensitive with the loss of cortisol, so you might have vomiting, diarrhea, but you're also not going to have the hormone aldosterone. And aldosterone is an important part of the system for sodium and potassium exchange in the tubule. So it's part of potassium regulation. So you want potassium in a very tight range between about 3.5 and 5.5. Remember we talked about that? And sodium is much more loose. And so there's an exchange, just like the sodium and potassium ATP ACE pump, for potassium out because you want to get rid of it, and sodium back. And so if you are an Addisonian and don't have this hormone, then sodium doesn't get to come back and potassium stays in. So Addisonians can have hyperkalemia and hyponatremia because they're losing the sodium in the urine instead of it being resorbed in exchange for potassium. So aldosterone deficiency in Addison's can cause that. And those are probably the main things that we see cause a hyponatremia. And then how do we get a hypernatremia? Oh, one thing I didn't say, lose sodium, but you could take in more water. So what if you're a polydipsic patient? You drink water behaviorally as a problem. You could make yourself hyponatremic. That's what happens to athletes after a marathon. They drink too much water, and then they become hyponatremic, and it actually can be life-threatening. So definitely taking in too much water would cause that as well because you dilute out the sodium in your bloodstream. So let's switch that. What if you didn't have any water? So if you had decreased water intake, like you took away the bowl of water, a poor animal that was caught in the basement or in the, stuck in the, and we've had a couple stuck in the attic or things like that, and they can't get any water, they can get hypernatremic. Or if you increase the sodium intake, increase intake. So what would that be with? Seawater, if you're drinking too much seawater, or paintballs can do it as well. So there's definitely different toxins that are basically sodium based. So you could decrease water intake or basically increase sodium intake. Now let's think about that on the loss as well. So instead of what's coming in, let's see what we're losing. So if we lost more water and less sodium, now what could do that to us? Well, we talked about it with Addison's, that there was a hormone issue, basically, that, could that loss of aldosterone, what if you had too much aldosterone? And that does happen. So you can have an aldosterone secreting tumor, and that might happen where you get a low potassium and hypernatremia. But there's other ways that sodium usually gets lost. You usually don't get too much of that. But there's another hormone to increase water loss, and that is called vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone. Let's talk about that. Antidiuresis. What does that mean? That's kind of a weird question, right? So diuresis is losing urine, right? Putting out more water in the urine. So if you're antidiuretic, then this hormone helps you resorb water. And I wish it was just called that. And so if you're not having that hormone, then you won't resorb water. You'll lose water, but not sodium. And that's the basic, most common hormone way that you could get hypernatremic. And why would that happen? Well, that is called diabetes insipidus, opposite of diabetes mellitus. And this hormone deficiency is pretty rare. But you may have heard of pets that are on DDAVP drops. And that may be because they have diabetes insipidus and they have drops to replace the hormone. They have eye drops. So that's something that does happen. More commonly, though, for increase of water loss, it's not a hormone problem, it's a kidney problem. And so the kidney will decide that it's mostly dysfunctioning in the resorption of water, but still keeping in the sodium. And it's just where the damage is. So you can have renal failure cause this, also diabetes. But if I look at the percentages here, so who of these guys is hypernatremic versus hypo, since I've put that in both categories, probably a good 30% are normal and not hyper or hypo, but then of the rest, probably 60% are hypo. Diabetics and renal failures are hyponatremic, and maybe only 10% are hyper. So the main abnormality is really to get hyponatremic because you're losing both. But it does happen. It also happens when we put them on high sodium fluids. We can make a renal failure diabetic patient hypernatremic because they can't put out the sodium that we give them. So those are the main things that cause hyper and hyponatremia. Now, chloride likes to follow sodium. So a lot of the same things like vomiting and diarrhea will cause hypochloridemia. And you certainly can also get it with diuretics because those are being all lost the same way through the gut and out through the urine. But there's also another situation for hypochloridemia that's really interesting that I like people to know about, and that is when you get a foreign body in a specific spot. So here's your stomach, your esophagus, and there's your duodenum, and then the rest of your small intestines, and it goes out. So what does the stomach do? Well, it breaks down food by having acid, and the most well-known acid is hydrochloric acid. So what happens here at the stomach is that protons, or the hydrogen, and chloride are pumped into the stomach, and they free up the water, and then they free up the salt or other compounds that they break away to get those pumped in. So this is a very acidic environment that has to be neutralized. And so as the food passes along, the bile duct comes in, and maybe pancreatic duct if you're cat, and in comes bicarb and other elements to neutralize all these guys in water, so that then you're not so acidic. Now, what happens if you have a foreign body? So let's put let's put a squeaky toy right here. And if that squeaky toy is obstructing things and everything's backed up and can't flow, and therefore the neutralizing agents can't come in, all of this chloride and hydrogen is either being sequestered in the stomach, like if they have a big old stomach, or puked out as they keep puking because they have a foreign body in there. So you've lost all of these protons and all of these chlorides. Well, what that does to your bloodstream out here, where you stole those and you didn't bring them back, is a hypochloremic, low chloride, metabolic alkalosis. So the bicarb measured in the blood is high, like maybe above 30. And your chloride may be below 100, even 90. And that's pretty pathognomonic in the dog, that there is an obstruction to the normal processing of acid from the stomach. So that's a pretty interesting and kind of a signal if you look at an ISTAT and see those things. And we'll do acid-base another time as well. So what about a high chloride? Well, that can happen if you lose more water, again, than like in diarrhea, and you lose sodium in the diarrhea, but for some reason you hold on to chloride, and that's pretty rare. Most of the time I see a high chloride due to contraction, or what they call it a contraction alkalosis, which means you're dehydrated. So dehydration, remember, you're stealing the water from your cells and other places, and it's not really in your bloodstream. You've gotten dehydrated, and so the chloride goes up. The sodium seems to balance and go out, but for some reason the chloride stays. So that's the one instance it can do things separate than the sodium will. Okay, so we did sodium and chloride. Let's go to calcium. Calcium's a little bit hard. So calcium lives in your bloodstream in 3 forms, and they do different things. So on a chem panel, it's the total calcium, and on the ISTAT CG8, it's the ionized calcium, and that's the free form that moves around and does stuff. So that's the active form. And that's only about 40% of the total calcium. Then there's some, about 10%, that's bound to different salts, like calcium carbonate, and then the rest is bound to albumin. So protein bound. So how these different things are affected can sometimes be different. If you have a low albumin, you might have a low total calcium, hypocalcemia, but not have a low ionized calcium, because it's just the amount that's bound to the protein. This bound to protein can't get into cells, can't act, whereas this is diffusible and can get into cells and do things. So really this is the important one that really counts. We know that, like, another way you could get hypocalcemic is if you put it somewhere. So if you put calcium into, let's say, milk, you can get eclampsia. So a nursing mom could get low calcium because you just put it all into milk. It can get also used up with inflammation. It's an inflammatory problem, and that definitively seems to happen with pancreatitis, especially with cats, and that can be a poor prognostic indicator. It can also be lost, again, through the kidneys with renal failure. You can lose it, but a lot of times we see that actually the opposite is true, and your calcium is increased in renal failure because you can't get rid of it, and you have hormones that are functioning differently with renal failure. So it's one thing we do worry about on the total calcium. Well, the thing to think about as well is that the calcium control is by 2 glands that are on top of your thyroid. So here's your trachea, in your neck, here's your thyroid, and here are your parathyroids, and you have a pair. And so they control calcium absorption, calcium from your gut, calcium in your bone, and so it's a relatively complex process. But if you lose your parathyroids, your calcium will go down. So that is what we watch our post-parathyroidectomy dogs so closely, is that they don't have calcium. But if you have too much, if you have hyperparathyroidism, and these things are putting out too much, you can actually get an increase of calcium. And the way it does it is a little bit the same way that other things that cause hyper, like renal failure and cancers, like lymphoma and anal sac cancer, can make it go up. They have ways to mimic this system and make your calcium go up. And then in some toxicities, vitamin D toxicity, which is also cholecalciferol in the rat bait, can do that as well. And then some cats have something called idiopathic, where it goes up and we don't know why. That's what that word means. Why is it important? It's not necessarily life-threatening, like sometimes the sodium, we'll talk about sodium separately, but like chloride, chloride doesn't really do you any harm, unlike the sugar and the potassium. Calcium, if it's low, definitely can be life-threatening and cause seizures. If it's high, isn't really life-threatening in the short term, but in the long term can cause your organs to become mineralized and malfunction. So that's it for part 2. Hope that helps.